thank you for being here. Just a note, many of you know of the incredible progress in our city right now, the momentum and the many good projects happening and the business development. We felt like this topic of race, even though it's a difficult topic, is also important for us to think about and consider and acknowledge as we move into the future as a city. And so it seems like unless we're honest, unless we're clear about some of our past, it might be hard to move into the future of Beaver Falls in an honest sort of way. And so I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's sort of a reason and a good invitation to be here and to talk about somewhat of a difficult topic. But with that, I'm going to have our city manager, Mr. McJones, introduce our speakers this evening.
Thank you, Wendy. Everybody hear me okay? As Wendy said, it's really nice to see so many of you come out tonight on this topic. The two gentlemen who will be speaking, I affectionately share with them often that when I grow up, I want to be like them. They've been really a good influence to me, and I'm just really honored to be able to introduce them. So the first speaker will be Dr. Brad Fry. Brad has taught at Geneva College for the last 33 years, primarily in the fields of sociology and higher education. He's a graduate of Geneva and received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh in Social Foundations of Education. He has lived with his wife Sue in Beaver Falls since 1984. 2 of his 3 adult children and 1 of his 5 grandchildren also live in Beaver Falls. With 4 friends, Brad helped to start the Community Development Corporation in response to a suggestion made by a regional planner who was consulting with the city. And 12 years ago, he and Wendy Walpley began the City House, a living, learning community done in conjunction with Geneva's sociology program. The City House gives Geneva students the advantage of living in a Beaver Falls neighborhood for a year. And then our next speaker will be Dr. Todd Allen. Dr. Todd Allen has spent the past 26 years working in higher education in a career that has included service in admissions, student life, faculty, and administration. A PhD in rhetorical studies from Duquesne University, Dr. Allen has taught a variety of courses that promote the intersection of diversity, civility, and the liberal arts, including interpersonal communication, intercultural communication, argumentation, and debate, group dynamics, and rhetoric of civil rights movement, to name a few. In 2002, he founded the Common Ground Project, a community-based nonprofit dedicated in promoting racial understanding and reconciliation. For the past 17 years, in partnership with the PNC Foundation, Dr. Allen has led the Returning to the Roots of Civil Rights tour, bus tour, an educational experience open to diverse participants, which uses visits to many of the key southern sites of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s as a vehicle for discussing contemporary issues of race. A native of Beaver Falls, PA, he's a 1987 graduate of Beaver Falls Area School District, where he also served 18 years as a member of the Board of Education. So if you will, can we help me welcome our speakers?
I'd like to thank Mr. Jones for his warm hospitality and for the introduction, as well as the whole lecture series committee for this invitation. You know, this is the subject of my PhD dissertation that for 20 years has been on like a shelf, and where most dissertations stay. You know, so to be able to pull it off was really great. I'd also like to thank Wendy Welpley for her leadership and for her technical help with this. And then I'd like to say this: it's a privilege for me to present with Dr. Allen. He's a remarkable scholar of the American Civil Rights Movement in specific, and communication and rhetoric studies generally. And it's humbling and exciting and wonderful to have a student become your teacher. So now, look, tonight I have a hard story to tell, and it's a story with no winners, and I sort of it's hard to tell at a time when there's, like Wendy said, when there's so many great things happening in our community, and so I tell it more because I think it's important that we much like an infection, if it's not opened, it can't heal. And so I just hope that by talking about these things and putting them out, that it opens us up to heal a little bit. I don't think I can heal much, but maybe just start a little bit. So let's get going with it, okay? Because, you're supposed to have pictures of the PowerPoint. I have 4 pictures tonight. They don't have anything to do with the talk. But that's my first picture. So thanks to Chad for helping in the back there. I don't know if you can see this, but let me start this way by saying my study was about the entire county, not just the Beaver Falls Blackhawk split. And that encompassed both the split of Aliquippa and Center, Midland and Western Beaver, and ironically, the joining of Baden and Economy and Harmony with Ambridge. The only one that really joined. Okay, and I'll say more about that in a minute because it's part of the story. Okay, so wait a second. I'm going to pull this out here. No, not. So Beaver County became a remarkable contradiction to everything the civil rights movement stood for, and cemented a legacy of racism that unfortunately is still alive in many ways, okay, in our county, in our community. Now, a couple things just about so I see a few people that might have been alive back then like me, but if not, let me tell you a little bit about the county at that point. At that point, Beaver County had a higher percentage of its workforce committed to heavy industry than any other county in America. So we were blue-collar central. Also, we had the unusual reality that our little industrial towns were pressed right up against rural communities. And so, larger cities would have certain rings of suburbs where things would, where density would get a little less and that sort of thing. But we had rural areas pressed right up against these little urban centers. And the racial attitudes in this point, we're talking about late 50s and mostly in the 60s, the racial attitudes were very similar to the Jim Crow South. For instance, many of you might not be aware that until the mid-80s, College Hill was a segregated neighborhood. You were not welcome there if you were not white. Okay, so that's our legacy, unfortunately. So now take a look. These are what we're looking at tonight is the Beaver Falls Blackhawk split. Okay. So at this point in 1960, these are the municipalities that are involved in these 2 districts. That is the Beaver Falls district and the Highland Suburban Jointure, it was called. It included Chippewa, Patterson Township, Patterson Heights, and West Mayfield. Okay? And you can, this is just U.S. Census data here, and you can see that in the communities that made up the Highland Suburban Jointure, not many African Americans. And I should just tell you this, that when you see 15 African Americans in Patterson Township, I don't know this for sure, but my guess is that's people that lived right across the street. That the Beaver Falls touches Patterson Township. My guess is some people, moved a block away, or, it was more that sort of thing than there being, but as it is, 15 people, it's at 3 families, So unfortunately, quite a disparity at that point. At this time, in all counties in Pennsylvania, every county had. All right, I don't know what I did. It's me, I'm sure. Like somebody my age in technology, we just don't mix,
It's the cords loose. I'm going to get this out of the way so you can move more freely.
I'll keep talking, okay? I take back the thanks for the technical help. At this time, every county had a Office of Education and a Superintendent of Education at the county level. We don't have that anymore. We have an intermediate unit which sort of facilitates getting resources to school districts. But at that point, the county superintendent, if you had a school district like Beaver Falls, you had a superintendent. If you had a jointure like Highland Suburban, you were technically under the direction of the county superintendent, who at that point was H.C. Elder, and also at that point Beaver Falls superintendent was L.D. Smith. So apparently, if you were a superintendent, you went by your first two initials. But one of the subplots in all that is the two of them were very, very large personalities, from what I'm told, and were rivals. So one of the subplots is they did not get along well together. I don't know that I'm going to solve it.
Carry on.
Yeah, don't. Oh, sorry. I've only ever done 3 PowerPoints in my whole life. I had such high hopes for this.
It's a plug thing. Don't touch it.
I have to touch the button. The other thing to know is this: that most of the people who worked in the county office of education also lived in the Highland Suburban jointure. And in several interviews, I was told they ran the county from the country club in Patterson Heights. And I was told by one school board member from the Highland Suburban jointure, he said, how would I describe them? He said, I guess today we would call them white supremacists.
Wow.
So that's a harsh label, right? And I didn't know the folks, so but that's how they were described to me. Okay. Picture number 2. Okay. This, of course, is our middle school now, but at the time we're talking about, of course, it was the high school. Okay. Now, schooling in the 1960s. Part of this story, for you to understand what all happens here, you have to understand that in the 1960s, this was the era of school mergers. This was the era of bigger is better in education. Now, you might not feel that way yourself. There are studies today that would say bigger is not better in education. But at this point, that was the educational orthodoxy. So look at some of this up here. So the state of Pennsylvania at that point had about 2,200 school districts. That's a lot, and they were starting legislation to reduce that to 350. So radical decline in numbers and adjustment in size. It turns out to be just over 500 by the time they're done. Okay, and it's done by merging existing districts primarily. Now, nationally and in Pennsylvania, the educational orthodoxy said we should shoot for school districts of the size of 8,000 to 10,000 students. That was seen to be as the target number. Now, after some back and forth in the state legislature, they ended up with 7,000 as their target number. Now, I just have to tell you a parenthesis at that point. By the end of the 60s, if you would have combined Black Hawk and Beaver Falls, you would have had almost exactly 7,000 students.
Wow.
So that would have been exactly on target for what they were looking at. Now, I mentioned the parts of the county that were targeted by the county board. We'll talk about that in just a second. And there was an exception to this 7,000 rule, and that was up in northern and central Pennsylvania, where it is so sparsely populated that to get 7,000 students in a school district, you have to put the kids on the bus at 6 in the morning, and they wouldn't get there till the next day in the middle of the afternoon. You know, I mean, it was just too sparse. And so they said, well, in those instances, we'll reduce it to 4,000, the target number, and in a couple cases, 3,500. Okay, so that was the thing. By the way, I should just tell you about these. You know, it was sort of interesting. In the 3 districts that separated, they all had a significant number of African American students. In the one district where the county office forced them to consolidate, according to this, no African Americans. So Ambridge was the only one that was forced. They didn't want to merge. They didn't want to merge either. But they were forced to merge. The rest of the districts weren't. Okay, by the county. So, and you'll see why that becomes. So here's my thesis, the stunner, I'm calling it. You might not be that amazed by it, but it was for me. While the rest of the country was struggling to desegregate their schools and consolidate them into larger districts, Beaver County brought a level of segregation to their schools that they had never had, and divided them into smaller units than they had had. So the 2 dominant things in education in America in the 1960s were reversed in Beaver County. They did technically reduce the number of districts. So if you remember those ones involved in the Highland suburban jointure, at the beginning of the 60s, they each had their own school board. That is, Patterson Heights, West Mayfield, Chippewa, all 4 had their own school boards. So they did merge that into one school board. So it looked as if they were reducing, they were reducing the number of school boards, but it was a shell game. They weren't really getting at the spirit of what was intended in these mergers. By the way, I just tell you, the merger, the rush to merger was driven mainly by 3 things. One was they thought bigger schools meant that you could have broader curriculums and more course offerings. They thought you could have more extracurriculars. You could have a lacrosse team. I don't think they had lacrosse teams back then. And it was more efficient, you know, more students, more efficiency. So now look at the bottom there. It says, African American students were intentionally segregated into 3 districts. At that point, now in most of our school districts now in Beaver County, there are African Americans in all our school districts. At that point, virtually none except in these 3 districts. And then they intentionally, So now, just some historical markers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because but I do have a whole chapter. So the first merger plan from the county office comes in 1953, and that's mainly just merging existing things like I was talking about in the Highland Suburban District. By 1958, because they were trying to move towards these mergers, Beaver Falls thought, we can prime the pump. White Township, who sent their kids to Beaver Falls High School, was behind in their tuition payments. And so Beaver Falls said, look, we'll forgive the tuition you owe us, and then we're going to join. White Township and Eastvale was willing to join. They said, we're just going to merge these 3 districts as sort of like the first step. Then in 1962, the state legislature passed Act 561, which was an attempt to merge districts. It was very controversial, statewide. And I don't know if you can tell, I tried to give you a little difference here. Notice what I have in parentheses there. The battle in the state was urban Democrats against rural Republicans. Not much changes. But notice in this first plan, the county office of education was to develop the plan, and then it went to the state, but I bolded the state approves because the state had the power. And then it had to be a plan that looked really good to them. In between 62, in November of 1962, William Scranton, a congressman from northeastern Pennsylvania, maybe the city was named after him, I don't think so, but was elected governor. He replaced David Lawrence, if you've been to the convention center, he replaced urban Democrat David Lawrence, and he defeated Richardson Dilworth, who was the mayor of Philadelphia at the time. So he becomes, so between the time this act is approved and it begins to be implemented, we have a change from urban Democrat to rural Republican. William Scranton, Governor Scranton, favored Act 561, but he had had a brutal primary fight with a guy, I can never remember this, a guy named Collins McCarran, who, get this, because we don't think of this as a major political force in Pennsylvania anymore, do we? He was the Grand Master of the Grange statewide. But he had run a very strong campaign on this issue. So Governor Scranton, in sort of an attempt to try to appease his political base, said, okay, I'll help get this changed. And so they change it in Act 291, and the main change there is one of emphasis. The actual parts of what they intend to do it's going to now be 472 districts instead of 350, but the main change is the county gets more power. So the county comes up with a plan, and then the state, unless it really violates the intent of things, approves it. Okay? And then about a quarter of the districts in the state appeal the plans. And so in 1968, they have to make a judgment that instead of the appeals going to the Department of Education, they actually set up a Commonwealth Court, a group of judges to hear the appeals. Now, look around here. I just have to tell you, like when I was doing my interviews and stuff like that, and here's the thing. So you can see that, the racism was real and intentional. Parents simply did not want their kid. I'm not talking about every parent. I'm not talking about every kid, but I'm talking about a majority of people. They just didn't want their kids to go to school with black kids. And so my very first interview I was doing with a former councilman from Beaver Falls, and I said to him, he said to me, they broadcast those hearings on this jointure over WBVP. And he said, I couldn't believe how ignorant people were. He said, if you believe that sort of thing, fine. I knew people weren't all on this, but they would scream into the microphone, my children will never go to school with those kind of people. And so because it was my very first interview, all the interviews I did after that, I'd ask them, sometime in the interview, I'd say, do you remember people at that time that were opposed to this saying these? Everybody on both sides of the issue, everybody I talked to said, yeah, we do remember that. How about this one, number 3? So I was interviewing a long-term school board member from one of the Highland suburban school boards, and he said this, he said, we knew, we were afraid that we might have newspaper reporters come to our meeting and report what we were talking about. So he said, we developed a code word. So the code word was quality education. So they said, whenever we wanted to talk about, but we don't want our kids to go to school with black kids, they wouldn't say that in their meeting. They'd say, well, remember remember, we're for quality education. And everybody said, oh, yeah. We're like, what school board isn't for quality education, you know? But they had that code. And this guy said to me, he said, look, I was for keeping the school together. He said, I wasn't very sensitive to issues of race. He said, I'd be lying if I told you I was some champion. He said, I was a football guy. And I just thought, if we got the big farm boys from Chippewa together with the skilled guys from Beaver Falls, we'd be unstoppable. And he said, so I would put, and so I would say in public meetings, I would say that. And he was a retired business person, and he opened his drawer and he pulled out this stack of letters. And he said, I'm not going to let you read these. He said, but I kept these. He said, because people wrote me letters and called me the most filthy, horrible things that you can ever imagine. He says, I take them out about every 8 months and just read them to remind myself how evil people can be. So a taste, I guess. So here's what actually happens. So in 1961, the state superintendent of education, that's what they used to call the secretary of education. So the state superintendent of education is here because he knows there's some turmoil. By the way, if you want to talk about this like afterwards, there are, as in all these things, there are many layers of things going on. For instance, Highland Suburban wanted to put an addition on their junior high school, and Beaver Falls High School wanted to put an addition on the high school. And that was a big, who's going to pay for it and all that. So, the money things are always controversial, right? So the state superintendent of education came in and said, look, I know each of your districts wants to do some pretty significant things financially. Let me tell you this. You don't merge, you're never going to see $1 from the state. I guarantee it. Well, that's a pretty heavy hammer, right? So people were like, oh, well, all right then, So they decide, okay, we'll go ahead with these merger plans. So at the beginning of 1962, they decide they're going to, all the municipalities agree that they're going to establish a study commission and sort of study the issue of merger. So they hired 3 professors from Westminster College. Westminster at the time it still does have a graduate program in education. And these 3 professors had all previously in their professional career been superintendents. So they thought these would be good people to come in and study things. So they interviewed teachers and administrators and school board members and parents and concerned citizens in every one of the municipalities. And then after the year's worth of study, they came and they said, merge, which I thought was like, not they're professional educators, that educational orthodoxy is bigger is better. What else are they going to say? But they say merge. All the municipalities approve it. Everybody approves it, but not everybody's for it. So that plan starts to go into reality. But the folks in the Highland Suburban jointure say, we really don't want that. And so they begin the process of appealing it. So their first appeal is held in 1965. I don't know if you can see this or not, but their appeal was based on 3 things. The first one was the people don't want to merge. That was not one of the reasons that the law gave for not merging, and they realized that. So when they were, reading the transcripts of this hearing, they said to the board, they said, look, we know this isn't a reason not to merge. We just want you to know, we really don't want to merge. So they were aware it wasn't sort of a reason that they would or would not be given permission, but they just wanted to go on record that they really, really didn't want this. The second one is geography mandates it. Well, in a second I'm going to show you the map. I I don't even know, like I've read the transcripts, I don't even know how they could do it with a straight face. You know, what geography separates us? You know, because what the state law was imagining is you've got a river that separates you and there's no bridge. Something like that. Or you're, up in Emlenton, they used to have a bridge that was so rickety that you wouldn't trust taking your car across it, let alone schools. That was the geography thing. So they contended that no, one district was up on the hill and the other district was down from the hill. Then the thing that they tried to make their biggest case for was travel is an unusual danger for students. And the reason they said that was that they said, look, if buses are coming down those hills into Beaver Falls, what if they lose their brakes? And honestly, if they did, what? It would be a tragedy, right? Those are steep hills and that sort of thing. So I mean, it's not. But I don't know how But that was it. The state, or the committee hearing the thing, said that didn't buy it. Said no, they did not approve the request not to merge. 2 years later, they come back again. By this point, more political change at the state level, more willingness to let people off the hook on these things. And quite frankly, the Beaver Falls district was saying, we're just worn out. This has been going on for a decade. We don't know how much longer we can do this. And so they just didn't have they kind of backed off a little, and Highland Suburban pushed hard, and the change in the state. So at that point, it was approved. 1971 then is the last year classes are held together. So a couple other things. Now, these are the municipalities. Okay, so this is Beaver Falls, this is Eastvale, West Mayfield, White Township, Patterson Township, Patterson Heights. This is Big Beaver, Coppell, Homewood, New Galilee, Darlington. Now, if the map was accurate, it would show South Beaver and Darlington Township going much further to your left and that sort of thing. But now look at how this is then finally decided. I just have to tell you, I presented this at national conferences. When I put this gerrymandered thing of districts up on a PowerPoint like that, people laugh out loud. Because I've told them that this is just one ridge. You don't know when you're moving from White Township to West Mayfield, from White Township to Patterson Township, unless there's a little sign there that says, you're entering it. It's all the same ridge. So it's just the worst example of gerrymandering for your own purposes. So the other thing is, after this split, both school districts have 3,500 students. What was allowed for the most rural districts in north central Pennsylvania. And the other thing I should tell you is that Big Beaver did not want to be part of the Beaver Falls School District. Their supervising principal, that was like the highest in a jointure, that was what would correspond to a superintendent. In the paper said, don't stick us with Beaver Falls. But my guess is that because of the percentage of people in Big Beaver that were getting subsidized lunch programs, it was the poorest district, so they decided we'll put the poor whites with the blacks. And I just have to tell you, at this point, we're talking 16% African Americans in Beaver Falls. We're not talking about sending them to, the heart of the urban inner city, with like 92%. We're talking 16% African Americans. It's shameful. I don't know what else to say. I have a couple. How many do?
You're about 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, good. Todd needs more time than me. There are a couple important things I want to say though. Here, the only thing I want you to notice here is in 1990, just about every municipality in the Blackhawk district besides Chippewa has seen a decrease of the few African Americans that they had earlier in 1970. So people, I'm just saying, people got the message, right? You know. Now, oh wait, no, don't look at that yet. So I wanted to say this, that although many African Americans had good experiences in Beaver Falls and in the Beaver Falls schools, there was still significant race issues here in town. I mean, it's nice to say, oh, those racists up on the hill. And I think what they did was despicable, honestly. But it didn't mean that things were that good in town either. So I just want to highlight two areas. One is employment, and the other is school. Okay, so if you look at this, this is Aliquippa. I didn't have this kind of data for Beaver Falls, but when there was a lot of turmoil in Aliquippa, they did, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission came in and did a lot of work in Aliquippa. One of the things they discovered was who got jobs at J&L. So now remember, this is a time when not quite, about 47% of Aliquippa at this point is African American. Okay, so of the 12,500 people that are employed in the mill, only about 1,000 of them are African. Now, obviously, the workers in J&L came from all over the area. They didn't just come from Aliquippa proper. But you see how disproportionate, we hear now, we lament all those good mill jobs that were once available to us, but those good mill jobs weren't very often available to African Americans. And then if you look further, you see that when they did get in the mill, they only got to the very bottom rung of the jobs for the most part. Now, I wish I had this kind of data for Beaver Falls. I don't, but this is what I do have. When I moved here in 1984, we still had a chapter of the NAACP in town. So I joined it. I thought it was a good thing to do, and it was. We had a marvelous president, Mrs. Margaret Moss, and we had a firebrand, okay, in our midst, Rocky Washington Senior. There's a good joke about that, but I'll say this right now. And Rocky got me and a retired serviceman from New Brighton named Jerome Crawford. And he said, we're going to go find out who hires African Americans and who doesn't in town. So we just walked into all the manufacturing things, and we said, we actually went over to the mall and got little name tags made, it said Brad Fry, NAACP, because we figured nobody's ever going to check it, and stuff. So we'd walk in and we'd say, we're from the NAACP. We'd just like to know how many employees you have, how many are African American. And most of the people were very forthcoming. They'd say, we have 50 employees, we have one African American. We have 70 employees, 2 of them are African American. But that's what we found, time after time after time. We went into one. Okay, I better not say which one, but we went into one of the mills and asked the question. They said, just a second. And they went into the back room, came back. You'll have to call our lawyer in Pittsburgh. And we're like, we're not having a protest. We're not. We just wonder how many people work here and how many are African American. We're doing some research for the NAACP. And he said, you'll have to call our lawyer, which we assumed was like, the big goose egg, or something. But anyhow, I don't know if that's true or not. So anyhow, I think this same reality was here. So even though our community embraced people of color, it not in the ways we should have. Okay, and then one other little thing here. So this is an analysis of different groups within the Beaver Falls schools in the 1960s. So you'll see I 1962, 65, 69. And I just highlighted a few that you might see. But you know, if it's important to have role models and people that you can look up to and model yourselves after, you know, that sort of thing. At this point, remember, 16% African American we have. In 62, we had 3 out of 68 African American teachers. In 65, 3 out of 71. And by 1969, we had 4 out of 83. So pretty radically underrepresented. Things like the homecoming court, radically underrepresented. You know, over in Aliquippa, until the late 60s, they never had any black cheerleaders. And when the Human Relations Commission was asking them that, they said, oh yeah, they try out every year, they're just not good enough.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So the National Honor Society, out of 87 people in the National Honor Society, 1 African American. In 65, out of 100, none. Out of 104 in 1969, 3. So as much as we can appreciate the good things that happen, we just have to say the schools weren't working very well for African Americans. And we can talk about my favorite is the slide rule club, you know, because you have to be my age to know what a slide rule is, you know, that sort of thing. You know? It's like the calculator club, you know. Just say this, couldn't find evidence of one white church that did anything to help.
Wow.
No evidence whatsoever. The college up on the hill, no evidence that they helped in any way. And I, as a white Christian and a 33-year employee of the college, I'm shamed by that. There was one religious group that spoke out very forcefully, and that was the Jewish community. We're very outspoken against it. And then I just have this stuff, you know, like results, Aliquippa, six weeks, 3 major riots, 1 huge day of rioting here in Beaver Falls. I don't know if Dr. Frazier is here or not, you know, but Dr. Frazier was involved in the riot. You know. He probably caused it for real. And in Midland, it was only stopped by, because the other 2 had already happened. So they had a massive police presence that kept that from breaking up. Those 3 districts that were isolated have also become the most distressed in the county. And of course, before Midland discovered cyberism, you know, they couldn't find a school in Beaver County that would take their kids. They were busing their kids to East Liverpool, their secondary kids to East Liverpool for school. Okay? And then you can see that other stuff we haven't today. And then my last picture. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, good evening. Good evening. It is indeed a pleasure to be back in my hometown. If I acknowledged everybody in the room that I know, that's all I would do tonight, so I'm going to be careful with that. Just so you know, even though I don't live in Beaver Falls anymore, 18 years ago when I joined the school board, I made it a habit every Friday during football season to wear my orange and black. And my students in Mechanicsburg will tell you every Friday during football season, I wear my orange and black. I want to thank Wendy and Mick and Regina for the invitation to be here this evening. To my good friend, Dr. Fry, I'll put it to you this way. It was interesting. So many things you were saying, and I'm thinking I can just sit down now. When you were talking, for example, about those board meetings happening at the country club, I thought, yeah, that was another one of those segregated places. I remember my dad telling me that blacks couldn't even be caddies at that place. Now, this evening, if in the few moments I have, if I say anything that's a little bit too strident or too strong for you, and you don't like it, well, if you like it, you can give me credit. If you don't like it, you can blame Brad, because it was that he had red hair then. Faculty member that I had at Geneva, who actually was the first person to get me to read the autobiography of Malcolm X. So, yeah. It's been said that the longer you look back, the further that you can see forward. And that's why I love about what this series is all about. It's a chance for us to look back and to learn, but to learn in order to change and transform our present and our future. You know, this year marks the 50th anniversary, if you will, of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I was reviewing one of his speeches recently, where he was asked the question about, what kind of progress have we made on race relations. And I'm just gonna quote from him. He says, people are asking the question, are we making any real progress in the area of race? This is a desperate question on the lips of many. There are at least three attitudes that can be taken towards the question of progress in race relations. The first is the attitude of extreme optimism. Now, the extreme optimist will point proudly to the strides that have been made in the area of civil rights over the last several decades. From this, he would conclude that the problem is just about now solved and we can sit down comfortably and do nothing. The second attitude can be taken is that of extreme pessimism. The extreme pessimist would contend that we have made only minor strides in the area of race relations. In fact, as we think about the tensions around us, we can realize that we've not come as far as we think, and so we might as well give up hope. From this, the extreme pessimist would conclude that no real progress is possible in race. But Dr. King goes on to say, now it's interesting to notice that the extreme pessimist and the extreme optimist agree on at least one point. They both feel that we must sit down and do nothing in the area of race relations. He says, but there's a third position, and that's the realist position. The realist in this area seeks to combine the truths of the two opposites while avoiding the extremes of both. And so the realist would agree with the optimist that we've come a long way, but they would also agree with the pessimist that we've still got a long way to go. And so as I thought about what Brad was going to share, I thought that being the younger of the two of us, I would share how I grew up in the wake of this context that he mentioned. But a couple things I do want to say. Wendy had talked about how people are reluctant so often to discuss race, and so for that I applaud you for being here for this discussion. But people give you some strange reactions. I'm just going to give you a few that people have said to me very recently about myself when it comes to race. You may perhaps find yourself criticized as a race baiter or playing the race card if you're black, or a race traitor if you're white. I had a friend sit with me in a restaurant. I didn't stay much longer after this. And they said, I follow you on social media, and if I didn't know you, this was their quote, if I didn't know you, I'd swear you don't like white people.
Wow.
And I looked at them and said, obviously you don't know me. And I got up and left. Don't know if that helped their thoughts about white folk. I had a former student, actually, get in touch with me last summer. I had this young man, he was a student at Geneva. For the sake of the story, he's white. I'm not making that up, he's white. So. But he took a course with me, actually a course that I kind of learned from Brad, but it was about race and culture and that kind of thing. And I remembered his name immediately when he reached out to me, but the gist of it was, he said, 20 years ago when I had you for that class, I didn't say much, I didn't contribute much, and one of the reasons I didn't is because I thought you were the problem. Wow. people like you always talking about race are the problem. He said, that's what I thought. I'm not proud of it, but that's what I thought. Now, this young man did not know kind of what I've been up to the last 20 years. But I moved to central Pennsylvania, literally probably about 40 minutes from where he is right now, where he grew up. And he says, but something interesting has happened in my life over the last several years. He said, I moved back to my hometown, and I'm married. My wife is Asian. We've got a couple of kids. And let's just say that they're not having the experience growing up in my hometown that I did. He goes, and so then I started to think about those things that you talked about 20 years ago. And he says, I want to say this. I mean, I know some people would say, well, yeah, that's nice of you to get it now because it's personal. And he says, I'm not looking, for, forgiveness or anything like that. He said, what I want to acknowledge is, I know these conversations can be difficult. I know they can be frustrating. I don't know what you're up to now, but hopefully you're still having these conversations. Right? A few weeks after I read that post from him, I'm looking at my new local paper, and I read about this course being taught at a school, an advanced placement course on race, ethnicity, and religion. And it just sounded fascinating to the point that I called the teacher and said, I want to come sit in that class. So I go over and visit this class. And this is a school district of several thousand students. And there's a couple sections of this class. I just randomly picked the one I went to. In the midst of the conversation, this young lady says, growing up here has been different for me. Different than like my dad. My dad's white, my mom's Asian, and I'm sitting there across the circle saying, what are the chances? But, I also know I had to go through so many clearances to get into school, you don't just start talking to random young people. So I just sat there and listened to her stories. And it nagged me so that I got in the car on my way home and called this young man and said, would you happen to have a daughter in the 10th grade at such and such? That was his daughter. Wow. And he says to me, that's something that I'm really proud of. He said, because I was in college and took a class 20 years ago that I didn't appreciate. My daughter now has the opportunity in high school to have conversations I wish I had had. I've been told that I'm a reversed racist, which I finally actually convinced the person, I actually baited him in a conversation to define racism for me. And then I said, define reverse. And then they kind of realized what I was doing. I said, so yeah, you ought to be a reverse racist too. We ought to be backing away from that stuff. You'll be told that race and racism is in the past that we have overcome. Right? In fact, that's the nice way they say it. A very rude way, they just kind of shout, get over it. I was speaking at a church, scheduled to speak at a church in my new adopted hometown. And it just happened to be the weekend that the riots happened in Charlottesville. So I was already scheduled. It was a service around civil rights and faith, and they had all these reconciliation themes built in. And I was really proud of this church. They ramped it up another level in light of Charlottesville. This is all white church, except for when I was there that day. And what shocked me, though, was the pastor of this church is up front, and he's doing this prayer of sort of repentance and reconciliation and forgiveness. And in the middle of his prayer, someone shouts from the back, get over it.
No.
And I'm sitting there on the front pew looking at the pastor, and I'm basically saying, dude, we didn't need that, extra drama. You should have told me you were going to have somebody staged in the congregation and shout that. And this all was in about 10 seconds. I realized as I'm looking at the pastor, his face goes from shock to hurt to anger. I'm like, oh, that was real. Somebody really said that. And then he stormed out. Now, I kind of wish that he had stayed because that's actually one of the talking points that I have when I do that talk about get over it. There's a awesome site, former plantation, in just outside New Orleans, Louisiana, called the Whitney Plantation. And it was founded by a gentleman, last name is Cummings. John Cummings, I believe is his name, a developer. And he just talked about the journey of why he built this place. What's unique about it is it tells the story of slavery not from the perspective of mint juleps and hoop skirts, but from the perspective of those who were enslaved, particularly the children in that region. And Cummings talks about how blacks were sort of suspicious of him in the region when he was going to do this thing because Are you going to make our, experience Disney? They said to him, what do you know about slavery? And he said, well, I'm a rich white guy, and I know rich white guys, so they had something to do with that. But then he says, whites would say to him, stop stirring up that trouble. Just get over it. And so he would say to them in response, what's the it we need to get over? And he said, no one could ever tell me the it. And so that's why we needed that place. That's why we need conversations like we're having tonight, so we can learn what it is, and maybe we will eventually get over it. So, people are often afraid to have these very real conversations, like I know you've been having, not just in the United States or the state of Pennsylvania or in the county, but even right here in our hometown. Sometimes when we have these conversations, and I think conversations are important. I think conversations are actions. But conversation isn't the only action that we need to be taking. Out of those conversations, we can't just focus on the individual or relational level of race in this country. Having coffee or some other favorite beverage of yours with someone who doesn't look like you. Having a book discussion, a Bible study, or even engaging in a pulpit swap. Not that those things aren't important, but if that's all you're doing to engage the conversation around difference, you're not doing much. Brad's research highly and effectively pointed for us the counteractions that people have taken at the institutional and systemic level on race, and why those who are in the right need to do all the more. I'm reminded when I hear Brad present his research of the truth that at times in this nation's history, people that look like me were lynched with ropes. I'm also reminded, however, that we've equally been lynched by policies. When we play those euphemistic games of, this one author calls polite racism, and we refer to things like quality education, or law and order, or forced busing, or states' rights, or neighborhood schools. If you've not seen a tremendous film called I'm Not Your Negro, focusing on the work of James Baldwin, it is just chock full of some excellent history. I want to read a couple of quotes in regards to education and integration in this country. One member, who was a member of the White Citizens Council, said this about Negroes and education. The moment a Negro child walks into the school, every decent, self-respecting, loving parent should take his white child out of that broken school.
Wow.
Another person, a woman, said this: God forgives murder, God forgives adultery, but he's very angry and actually curses all who integrate. I was reading a book recently by the historian Jean Theo-Harris. It's called A More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. And she says, as eloquently as Brad does this, you didn't need a governor at a schoolhouse door if you had Board of Education officials constantly adjusting school zoning lines to maintain segregated schools. You didn't need a burning cross if the banks used maps made by the Federal Housing Authority to mark black neighborhoods as dangerous for investment and deny black people access to home loans. You didn't need white vigilantes if the police were willing to protect and serve certain communities while containing and controlling others. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the publication of Dr. Cornel West's book, Race Matters. In this text, West says many great things. One of the things he reminds us, quote, you must let suffering speak if you want to hear the truth. And sometimes that's what we don't want to do, whether it's a conversation around race or just a general conversation, period, is we don't want to hear the suffering of others. We just kind of want to get to the we have overcome moments. Likewise, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the gathering of a group called the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders. We may know that better as the Kerner Commission, a body put in place to study the riots of 1967 that were all over this nation. And in their report, which the federal government really didn't do much with, they highlighted this. They said, our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. I think the commission got it partially right. We're indeed two societies, but it didn't begin in 1967. I think it finds its origin in the very founding of our nation. 50 years later, follow-up report by one of the last surviving member of this commission called Healing Our Divided Society, Fred Harris, reminds us that we've still not addressed what was in that Kerner report 50 years ago, that we see around us a climate marked by increased racial tensions, persistent inequality, violence, and inaction. When I think about this history, I am just really taken with how personal it can get. I think about lessons I learned from my father, not that my mom's not important, make sure y'all tell it. And the talks that we had, the same talks that unfortunately I'm having with my son, and my fear that he'll have to have with his son someday, about what it means to be black in these United States. Now, my father passed about 10 years ago, and when I was going through some of his belongings, it was powerful for me to see this elementary school picture. You might not be able to see him where you are, but that's him in the upper left corner. But this is 1940s, pre-Brown versus the Board of Education, up south, here in Beaver Falls, White Township, is that elementary school. And I think this week, with the passing of Linda Brown, whose name becomes synonymous with that Brown versus Board of Education decision, it's important to just make that connection between that history that's out there and that history that's right here for us. But some things that this man taught me about race and education. The value of an education to transform one's condition, to treat others with the same respect that you would want them to treat you with, but also know that there are going to be times when people will try to discount you. The need to be, and this is something that's a common refrain, not just from my father, but unfortunately the fathers, the parents of many families of color that I know, the need to be, quote unquote, twice as good.
Say that.
Twice as good. What do I mean by that? It's a common refrain in the African American experience that you cannot afford to be just as good as that white colleague sitting next to you if you're going to get just as far. You've got to be twice as good to hopefully get just as far, but know that you'll also have your skills discounted along the way. I stand here today as an earned PhD, but I've had a supervisor tell me at that place up on the hill that they heard, quote unquote, how I snuck through the back door to get where I am.
Jeez.
Oh, I unpacked that for him just as well as I did the ghetto. My own experience growing up segregated while appearing to be integrated. And I like to tell my students we're not talking ancient history. I came on the scene about 1969. But I grew up on the hill. A mostly black neighborhood, mostly black social circle. Parts of the hill were integrated, but not fully. And I attended, quote unquote, integrated schools. But even in those integrated schools, as Brad mentioned, things can be difficult. I can still vividly remember playing on one of those integrated sports teams right down there at Moultries. And that was the first time someone had ever called me a nigger, a teammate
Wow.
at that. Now, I wasn't a proponent of nonviolence then, so you can imagine how I worked that one out for him. the bigotry of low expectations, even from some of your teachers. Fortunately, I had parents who were invested in my education, but an elementary school teacher told them about me one time, quote, "Hold him back because he will always, always be behind his peers," unquote. I just had my 30th reunion not too long ago. I've looked at some of my peers. I think I'm okay. We talked about separate educational tracks a little bit. The persistent fears around interracial dating and interracial relationships. One of my favorite memories was the prom. And by this point, I had moved to White Township. And I remember hanging out with some of my friends, white friends. And, you know, sometimes people get comfortable around you and they forget you're there and they say some things. And I remember when it was time to select the theme for the prom, these guys actually said, "We are tired of all these nigger songs. When we go in there tomorrow, we're going to vote for something white." I'm looking at them like, this ought to be good. So I said, "Well, what's something white that we might vote for?" And these fools actually answered me. So they had the numbers, so I knew they would win. But I said, "Remember, we're voting on a theme, right? We're voting on a theme." So the theme they came up with was from Led Zeppelin, "Stairway to Heaven." And they felt really good about themselves. And then I said, "All right, fellas, check this out. How about we vote me," since I was, I think, class vice president, "we vote me in charge of entertainment," meaning I book the DJ and all that, right? They said, "Okay." So at worst, I was thinking somewhere between the prom and the post-prom, we'll lose that album. That's what we played back then. Right? I was sitting with a parent and I said, "Yeah, these folk came up with Stairway to Heaven." And she said, "Oh, by the OJs." And I was like, "That's right, the OJs." So first time Stairway to Heaven was requested that night, it was Led Zeppelin. Anytime Stairway to Heaven was requested the rest of the night, it was the OJs. To this day, that's one of my favorite songs. Brad talked about, you know, the importance of teachers that look like you, and I'm going to rush on here. He mentioned Mrs. Moss, that's her daughter there, Paulette Potter. And I had the fortune of having her as a teacher in junior high as well as high school. But I remember it was in high school where she transformed my life the most, kind of asking me that question, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And at that point, I was going to the NBA. You couldn't tell me otherwise. And she said, "Well, what if you get hurt?" "I'm not going to get hurt. I'm 15. 15-year-olds don't get hurt." Well, finally, she pressed me to actually just think about all the money I was going to make, and I should protect it. So I should probably get serious about academics. And that changed my life. She helped me to navigate this tension that I was feeling, not only outside of my community, but inside my community. That tension that we sometimes trick people to think you've got to be popular or smart. All right? Because, you know, racism has a way of not only puffing up the racist, but degrading those who are the targets of that racism. And so I used to have people that looked like me tell me that I was acting white. Unfortunately, 30 years separate my son and I, and he's been told the same thing. Started my career at Morehouse College, and then came home to a place I swore I'd never go, Geneva College, but I'm glad I went. I wouldn't have met people like Brad. But even before I began my classes at Geneva, and I don't think Brad even knows this, I was at the gym playing some basketball, and then I kind of hung out in the locker room a little bit. And I listened to these folk later who I found out were faculty, talking about this black kid from Beaver Falls who was at Morehouse, was a pretty good student, but he's coming to Geneva now. And some of them were pretty excited about it. But one of them in that locker room said, "Oh yeah, but that's a black school that he went to." Fortunately, I didn't know who it was that said that, but that motivated me because I did better at that white school than I did at the black one. In that experience, though, I realized the importance that reconciliation takes key, particularly for me as a person of faith. And so even though I tell you some of the stories that that lead to what a colleague calls reconciliation blues. It's good to have those blues. There's nothing wrong with the blues. I like listening to the blues. But you can't always stay in the blues. Sometimes you gotta go with the OJs and Stairway to Heaven. Now, my adult years, just real quick, Brad was talking about employment discrimination. I remember talking with people and hearing, there's different ways that discrimination takes place. Gone are kind of those days when they bar you from the door. We'll let you in. We'll even let you fill out an application. But they might hand me a black pen when I fill mine out, and they'll hand you a blue pen when you fill yours out. So after we've left and they're looking at the applicants, we know who's who, right? That happens. That happened. I know what it's like to be the token black on a community board. And they picked you because somebody said, well, we've got to have diversity. But then you go to meetings and nobody even talks to you. And you can tell they had the meeting before the meeting, right? Because they vacation together, because they live in the same neighborhood with each other. They go to church with one another. I've had that experience. I've also had the experience of applying for a job or for positions where you knew within 5 minutes of walking in the room, you weren't getting it. You weren't getting it. They just brought you there so they can be told. So later, they can say, we had a diverse pool, right? Yeah. It's in that context, then, that I'm blessed to raise this young man. Great article that I saw in The Atlantic recently called The Heavy Burden of Teaching My Son About Racism in America. I remember when it was time for him to go to a preschool. And I wanted to go one place, my wife wanted to go another. She won, but I told her, I don't want my son to be the Jackie Robinson of preschool. And sure enough, he was. It was only a matter of a couple of days where he didn't want to go to school anymore because no one up there would talk to him and nobody up there would play with him. And that's what he thought school was like. I remember when he was in elementary school, a teacher sending home one of the most caustic letters I've ever seen, talking about something was wrong with my child. And again, I should think about holding him back. And at this point, I'm on the Board of Education. I'm thinking, how stupid do you have to be to send a board member a letter, let alone any parent? But anyway, blessed though, in 2017, to watch 30 years separate us, to watch that young man walk across the same gym floor that I did, to get his degree from our alma mater. And he did a little bit better than his dad. He was the first African-American valedictorian of that school. But I told him, I said, don't think that you were the first, meaning you were the smartest. Because there were people much smarter than you who maybe were not afforded those same opportunities. But also realize that education is not for you, it's to serve other people. Now, some people ask then, why do I do what I do? There are many reasons why I do what I do, one of which is this young lady here that I have never met. Her name is Kelsey. As you've heard, I lead the civil rights tours of the South. Some of you in this room have been blessed to travel with you on those journeys. Well, a few years ago, I was leading a group from Rhode Island, and we were in one of our first museums in Greensboro, North Carolina. And one of the first exhibits you walk in is just filled with all of these examples of hate that occurred during the movement, particularly bombings and lynchings and whatnot. And I've watched people have very emotional reactions in that exhibit. But this was the first time I'd ever seen this. This young woman looks at this exhibit and just immediately falls to the floor, uncontrollable, unconsolable. And I was just kind of the tour guide here, and it's the first day. And I'm looking at her faculty saying, somebody gonna get that? And they all looked away. Right? After some time, I was able to get her up off the floor, but it was many hours later where we could actually talk about her reaction and what triggered that. And what she said was this, is that a month before we traveled, her daughter, Kelsey, that's her there, had committed suicide by hanging herself. And she said the reason that she did it, she was living with her grandparents at the time in a district that did not have much diversity. But things were going well. She was a very pretty girl, very popular girl, that kind of thing. Until a white family on the block decided to adopt a couple of African American children. And she said then the racial slurs began to fly, even from those who she thought were her friends. And she said to them, well, if you don't like them, then you don't like me, because I'm part black too. And they said, you're lying, da, da, da. And then they started to realize, oh, she's telling the truth. Well, you know what, we don't like you either. And then they began to target her with the slurs and hate and what have you, to the point where the night before she killed herself, she had posted on her Facebook page, I'm tired of all the hate, I'm tired of all the hurt, I'm tired of all the discrimination, I'm just tired. And Kelsey thought the solution was to kill herself. Now, her mom came on this trip and she said, you know, I wasn't going to come, obviously, because of what had happened, but when I thought about what this experience was like, or meant to be like, I knew that Kelsey would want me to be here. And I share that story with you not just for some dramatic sort of purpose, but I said to her mother, you have given me renewed energy and focus on the work that I do and why it's important. And with your permission, anytime that I'm talking to a body about issues of race in this society, you know, sometimes they think I'm just talking about the past. I want to share Kelsey's story. Last thing, because I know we're out of time. The late Reverend Samuel Billy Kyles, a good friend of Dr. King, said, quote, some do not want to talk about matters of race because it's too painful. Others don't want to talk about race because it's too shameful. If we're ever going to move forward together as a nation, as a state, as a county, as a city, we've got to collectively confront our pain and shame of our shared history. You know, as they say, history's got a way of repeating itself. Brad mentioned how we had kids from Pennsylvania going to school in Ohio because no one here would take them. This region will again be grappling with the question of consolidation of its schools. It's not a matter of if, but when. This is why we must know the history of our schools and our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our social clubs, and our churches. It's only in knowing this past that we can dismantle it in the present to transform our future. And that's the work that we must do. Thank you.